Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to share another quiet hour of reason with you. Tell me, have you ever studied a letter twice, wondering if the seal upon it told the whole truth? Watson learned that ink and wax can be made to lie, though never quite well enough to deceive a patient eye. Do subscribe, and find us also on Spotify, the link waiting just below. Now lean in and listen, for as Holmes believed, truth hides gladly in the smallest seal. Chapter 1. The Fog at Baker Street. It was, as I recall, one of those evenings in late November when London seems to withdraw into herself, when the fog rolls up from the river in slow yellow coils and swallows the gas lamps whole, leaving only pale and trembling halos to mark where light had once been. The wheels of the hansom cabs were muffled to a whisper, and even the cries of the newsboys on the corner of Marylebone Road came to my ears as though filtered through wool. I had dined early that evening and made my way to our old rooms in Baker Street, drawn less by any particular errand than by the simple and comfortable habit of some years' standing. I found Sherlock Holmes in a mood I had come to recognise well, restless, faintly irritable, and occupied with some small and, to my eye, purposeless experiment. He was seated at the table with a stick of sealing wax, a candle, and several sheets of what appeared to be old legal parchment, upon which he was pressing seals and studying the impressions with his lens. "You're examining wax, Holmes," I observed, settling into my accustomed chair by the fire, though I confess I cannot see to what end. "Wax, my dear Watson, is a most communicative substance," said he without looking up. "It remembers the pressure of the hand that shaped it, the heat at which it was melted, and the age at which it was broken. A criminal may disguise his hand, his voice, even his face, but he rarely thinks to disguise his wax." He set down the stick and regarded me with that quick, appraising glance which I had learned meant he found some small deduction in my appearance. "You have been to your club, and you have walked rather than taken a cab, for your left trouser leg is spotted with mud to the knee, while your right is clean. You favour your old wound in this weather, I think." "You're quite right as usual," I said, though I failed to see what wax and old wounds have to do with one another. He laughed and was about to reply when we heard the bell below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's measured tread upon the stair, and a moment later a card was brought up which read, "Mr. Edwin Larchmont, solicitor, Lincoln's Inn Fields." "Show him up," said Holmes, and I saw the light of interest kindle in his deep-set eyes, for a solicitor who calls after dark in such weather, upon such short notice, is not a man who comes about a trifling matter. Mr. Larchmont proved to be a spare, grey gentleman of perhaps 55, with the stooped shoulders and ink-stained fingers of one who has spent a lifetime among documents. He was, I saw at once, in a state of considerable agitation, though he strove to master it with the professional composure of his calling. He carried a leather dispatch case fastened with 2 brass locks, which he set upon his knees, and did not once relinquish during the whole of our interview. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I come to you upon a matter of the most delicate character, involving, I fear, either a grievous injustice or a fraud of uncommon skill. I confess I do not know which, and it is precisely that uncertainty which has driven me from my own fireside on such a night as this." "Pray begin at the beginning," said Holmes, leaning back in his chair and forming his fingertips into that familiar steeple, "and omit nothing, however small it may appear to you." The solicitor required a moment to compose himself before he spoke. "You will not have heard, perhaps, of the late Mrs. Honoria Vale, a widow of some considerable fortune, who resided in Kensington and died some 3 weeks past. She left, so far as any of us knew, no will. Her nearest relative was believed to be her niece, Miss Clara Vale, a young woman of excellent character who has lived under her aunt's roof these several years, and who confidently expected to administer the estate. It was, indeed, all but settled that she should do so." "And yet," said Holmes. "And yet, Mr. Holmes, some 10 days ago a gentleman presented himself at my office, one Mr. Silas Redmond, bearing letters of administration, granted by the court, which establish him as a cousin of Mrs. Vale's through her mother's family, and which give him full authority over the estate. The documents appear upon every examination I have been able to make entirely regular. The seals are correct, the signatures proper, the court stamp beyond question. And yet, sir, something in the affair troubles me exceedingly, though I could not, if you pressed me, say precisely what." "You suspect forgery," said Holmes, "though your reason has found no fault to justify your instinct. That is often the way with the best forgeries, Mr. Larchmont. They satisfy the eye while offending some subtler sense we cannot readily name. Tell me of this Mr. Redmond." He is modest in his manner, quiet, even apologetic, as though embarrassed by his own good fortune. He has been most helpful throughout, offering to settle the estate quickly and quietly, so as to spare, as he puts it, further distress to the family. The solicitor's lip curled faintly as he pronounced these last words, and I saw that some deep professional unease lay beneath his outward composure. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his eyes half closed, his thin fingers drumming softly upon the arm of his chair. "A man who forges a signature," he said at last, "steals what may be recovered. A man who forges authority steals what is often gone beyond recall before the fraud is even suspected. I confess, Mr. Larchmont, that a case of forged legal authority interests me more than the theft of the crown jewels themselves, for it is a crime built entirely upon appearances, and appearances properly examined never wholly deceive." He rose and reached for his pipe. "Watson, I think we shall want our coats. The fog will not lift before morning, but I have a fancy to look upon Kensington before it does." Chapter 2. The Vale Townhouse. The fog had thinned but little by the time our cab drew up before the Vale residence in Kensington, and the tall house loomed above us with an air of shuttered dignity, its windows curtained in heavy velvet against the damp evening air. It was the sort of dwelling one associates with a long and prosperous widowhood, solid, comfortable, and entirely without ostentation, save for a certain excess of dark mahogany, within which seemed to absorb what little light there was. We were admitted by a housekeeper of middle years, stern of countenance but not unkind, who gave her name as Mrs. Agnes Pritchard, and conducted us to the drawing-room with the deliberate tread of one long, accustomed to the ordering of a great house. The room itself struck me at once as a chamber preserved rather than lived in, every ornament in its appointed place, every chair arranged as though awaiting a mistress who would not return. Miss Clara Vale rose to receive us. She was a young woman of perhaps 26, dark-haired, pale, and possessed of that particular composure which I have observed often conceals a considerable strength of feeling beneath it. She greeted Holmes with a directness that I found engaging. "I am glad Mr. Larchmont has brought you into this affair, Mr. Holmes," said she, "for I confess I begin to doubt my own judgment. I've told everyone who will listen that I never heard my aunt speak of any cousin named Redmond, and yet I am treated as though my memory itself were in question." "Your memory, Miss Vale, is not on trial," said Holmes gently, "though I shall want to test it none the less in the friendliest possible spirit. Was there, to your knowledge, any correspondence in the house from a Redmond family, however distant?" "None that I ever saw. My aunt's papers were extensive, but I managed her correspondence for the last 2 years of her life, and I encountered no such name." A gentleman who had been standing near the window now came forward and introduced himself as Captain Julian Marlowe, a friend of long standing to the family. He was a well-made man of military bearing, with the easy, faintly theatrical charm of one accustomed to being liked, and he spoke of Redmond's claim with an indignation that seemed to me entirely genuine. "It is monstrous, Mr. Holmes," said he. "The man appears from nowhere with his lawyers and his documents, and the courts, which ought to protect the defenceless, instead arm him against them." "The courts protect only what is placed before them," Holmes replied, "and a document, properly executed, carries a presumption the law is reluctant to disturb. It is precisely for that reason that a forger who can satisfy the outward forms is more dangerous than one who cannot." Mrs. Pritchard, questioned in her turn, could add little save to confirm that her late mistress had never, in her long years of service, so much as mentioned a relative of that name. "She was not a woman to hide her family from her own household, sir," said the housekeeper with some asperity. "Whatever this Mr. Redmond may be, he is no cousin that I ever heard of." We had not been above a quarter of an hour in the house when the subject of our inquiry himself was announced. Mr. Silas Redmond proved a surprise to me, for I had formed, I confess, an image of some bold and confident adventurer, and found instead a modest, almost apologetic gentleman of middle age, plainly dressed, with a diffident manner and a habit of glancing sideways when he spoke, as though uncertain of his welcome. "I am aware, Mr. Holmes, that my position here is a distressing one for all concerned," said he, "and I would give a great deal to have come into this inheritance by some gentler road. I have nothing to hide, sir, and I invite you to examine my papers as closely as you wish." He produced from an inner pocket a folded document, somewhat worn at the creases, which he handed to Holmes with every appearance of candour. Holmes received it without haste and studied it for some minutes beneath the lamp, his lens in hand, while the rest of us watched in a silence broken only by the ticking of a tall clock in the corner. I observed him note the court stamp, examine the signature with particular care, and hold the paper to the light so as to study the fold marks that ran across it. Once he raised it briefly to his face, as though testing some faint odour that clung to the paper, though he made no remark upon it. His countenance throughout betrayed nothing of his thoughts. "The document appears in excellent order, Mr. Redmond," said he at last, returning it. "I compliment whoever prepared it upon their thoroughness." Redmond bowed slightly, plainly relieved, and Holmes turned his attention, with an appearance of idle curiosity, to the room itself. He crossed to Mrs. Vale's writing desk and examined the blotting pad that lay upon it, and I saw him glance also at the cold ashes in the grate, and at a locked cabinet in the corner which, Miss Vale informed him, contained the family's old correspondence. He asked one or two questions of no apparent consequence regarding the household's habits, and then declared himself satisfied for the present. It was as we were preparing to take our leave that the single incident occurred which I was afterward to remember most vividly, though at the time it struck me as nothing at all. Mr. Redmond, in the small courtesy of the house, was asked to enter his name and the date in the visitor's book that lay upon the hall table, a custom, Mrs. Pritchard explained, that Mrs. Vale had always observed. I watched him take up the pen, and there was something in the manner of his grip, awkward, over-careful, the wrist held stiffly rather than moving with the easy flow of habit, that arrested my attention for the briefest of moments before I dismissed it as fancy. I said nothing of it in the cab, but as we rattled homeward through the thinning fog I observed that Holmes was unusually silent, his brows drawn together in that particular fashion which I had learned to associate with some small fact, newly acquired, working its way through the machinery of his mind. "You noticed something in the visitor's book," I ventured at last. "I noticed," said Holmes slowly, "that Mr. Silas Redmond holds a pen as a man holds a tool he has been taught to use, rather than one he has used all his life. It is a small thing, Watson, but small things, properly weighed, have hanged better men than he." Chapter 3. The Seizure of the Estate. 3 days passed before the next development in the affair, and they were days in which Holmes, so far as I could tell, did nothing whatever regarding the matter, occupying himself instead with a monograph upon the varieties of cigar ash, which he had long threatened to write. I had learned, however, not to mistake his apparent idleness for want of application, for I had seen too often how some quiet process continued beneath that indolent exterior, like a mill-wheel turning unseen below the surface of a pond. It was on the 4th morning that Mr. Larchmont came to us again, and this time his agitation had given way to something graver, a kind of resigned distress that I found more troubling than his earlier nervousness. The court, he informed us, had confirmed Redmond's authority in full. Officers had that very morning attended at the Kensington house, and Miss Vale had been required, under protest, to surrender the keys to our aunt's strong-box, together with the account books and the greater part of the family papers. Captain Marlowe was present, said Larchmont, and I am bound to say he conducted himself with more heat than discretion. He threatened Redmond openly in the hearing of the officers, with legal proceedings and worse besides. It has done Miss Vale's cause no good, Mr. Holmes, however natural his indignation. Holmes received this news with no great surprise. The law, once satisfied of a document's regularity, moves with a certain blind haste, said he. It is precisely this haste upon which the clever forger depends. But you have not walked through this fog merely to tell me what I might have predicted, Mr. Larchmont. Something else has occurred. The solicitor's face confirmed the truth of this before his words did. You're right, sir. Last evening, some hours after the seizure, Mrs. Pritchard discovered that a locked drawer in the library had been forced open. It contained, so far as can be ascertained, a number of private letters and a small bundle of family certificates, papers of sentimental value chiefly, of no great worth to anyone save the family itself. The police have been summoned, and I regret to say that suspicion has fallen upon Miss Vale. We proceeded at once to Kensington, where we found Inspector Lestrade already established in the library, wearing the particular expression of brisk satisfaction he reserved for cases in which the solution appeared, to his mind, entirely evident. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," said he, "you have come rather late in the day, though I dare say there is little enough here to trouble you. It is a plain business. Miss Vale, fearing the loss of her inheritance, forced this drawer in search of some paper that might discredit Mr. Redmond's claim. The marks upon the lock are fresh, and the young lady, I'm sorry to say, refuses to account for her movements during the hour in which the deed must have been done." "She refuses, or she has not been properly asked," said Holmes. "She has been asked plainly enough, and has given no answer beyond that it is her own affair. That is not the manner of the innocent, Mr. Holmes, in my experience." "Your experience, Lestrade, is considerable, and I do not dispute it in the general case," Holmes replied, with a courtesy I knew concealed a certain private amusement. "But permit me to look at the drawer before we determine what manner belongs to the guilty and what to the merely embarrassed." He knelt before the small escritoire in the corner of the library, drawing out his lens, and I watched him proceed with that unhurried, almost reverent attention to detail which I had witnessed so many times before, and which never failed to impress me anew. He examined the scratches about the lock for some minutes, then turned his attention to the carpet and the bare boards beneath the desk, and finally to a small object which he lifted between finger and thumb from the fringe of the carpet itself. "The scratches, Lestrade, are broader than any common key would make," said he at length. "A skeleton key, or a delicate implement such as a lady might carry, would leave a narrower mark than this. Whoever forced this lock did so with something clumsier, and, I should think, larger than the occasion required." "A poker, perhaps, or some such tool," said Lestrade, unmoved. "It proves nothing as to who wielded it." "Observe also the dust beneath the desk," Holmes continued, indicating the floor with the tip of his cane. "It has been disturbed upon one side only here, nearest the window, and not upon the other. A person kneeling to force this lock from the front, as any natural approach would suggest, must disturb the dust upon both sides more or less evenly. This disturbance suggests a person who knelt at an angle, favouring the left, as one might who approached from the direction of that door rather than this one. I confess I could make nothing of this myself, though I dutifully examined the floor as Holmes had done and saw only a faint, formless smudging that told me nothing at all." "And this," said Holmes, holding up the small object he'd taken from the carpet fringe, "is a sliver of black sealing wax, broken, and lying some little distance from the drawer itself. I will trouble you to note its position, Lestrade, and to see that it is not swept away with the general debris of your investigation. Wax, Mr. Holmes? The house is full of wax, I should think, in a family so given to correspondence." "No doubt," said Holmes, and pocketed the fragment without further remark in a manner that told me, who knew him well, that he attached to it an importance he did not yet care to explain. I remarked afterward, once we had quitted the house, that I could not see what interest a mere splinter of wax could hold for him, when the drawer itself, forced and rifled, seemed a far more eloquent witness. "The drawer, Watson, tells us only that someone wished us to believe a burglary had occurred," said Holmes, drawing his coat about him against the raw evening air. "It is the small and apparently meaningless things, the things a careless man leaves behind because he does not think them worth removing, that generally tell us the truth of a matter. The papers taken were of sentimental value only, remember, and not of the financial kind one would expect a fortune hunter to seek. That fact alone, my dear fellow, is worth a dozen forced locks." Chapter 4. The Helpful Clerk. The offices of Mr. Edwin Larchmont occupied the second floor of a narrow soot-blackened building in Lincoln's Inn Fields, and it was thither that Holmes proposed we should go upon the following morning, remarking that a forged document, like a forged coin, must at some point have passed through honest hands before it found its way into circulation. We were received by Larchmont himself, who conducted us through a low outer chamber lined with black deed boxes to a smaller room where a young man sat bent over a mass of papers, copying with a swift, neat hand. He rose at once upon our entering, and I was struck by the mildness of his countenance, a pale, unremarkable face redeemed chiefly by a pair of quick and attentive eyes. "This is Mr. Tobias Finch," said Larchmont, my junior clerk, "and I may say without exaggeration one of the most conscientious young men it has ever been my good fortune to employ. It was Finch who first examined Mr. Redmond's papers upon their presentation, and I have relied upon his report of them a good deal more than perhaps I ought to admit." Finch coloured slightly at this praise, and made a small deprecating gesture with his hand. "I did no more than my duty, sir," said he in a quiet, precise voice. "I confess the papers seemed to me, upon first examination, entirely regular. Indeed, I was able to be of some small service in confirming the family connection, for I discovered in an old memorandum among Mrs. Vale's own correspondence a passing reference to a Redmond branch of the family. It was this, I believe, which satisfied the court so readily." "A fortunate discovery," said Holmes, "and one which must have required no little diligence, given how obscure such a reference would ordinarily be." "I have always found," said Finch with the faint self-effacing smile of a man unused to compliment, "that the truth in matters of this kind generally lies buried rather than displayed. One has only to be patient enough to dig for it." Holmes asked him then to walk us through the process by which such letters of administration were customarily filed and copied, and Finch complied with evident willingness, explaining the forms in a manner both lucid and thorough, so that even Lestrade, had he been present, could have found no fault with his candour. I observed, as he spoke, that Holmes's gaze moved continually about the small room, resting now upon a drying rack hung with copied documents, now upon a squat black bottle of ink that stood apart from the others upon the clerk's table, now upon a wastebasket in the corner which, though it had plainly been emptied that morning, still gave off the faint, acrid odour of burned paper. "You keep a separate ink for legal copying, I observe," said Holmes, lifting the black bottle and turning it thoughtfully in the light. "It dries with less shine upon official parchment," Finch explained. "Mr. Larchmont insists upon it for anything bearing a court stamp." "A sensible precaution," said Holmes, setting the bottle down again with every appearance of having satisfied a merely idle curiosity, though I, who knew him, suspected otherwise. It was as Finch reached across his table for a fresh sheet of paper that I noticed, quite by chance, a small burn upon the ball of his right thumb, angry and only lately healed. Holmes's eye had evidently fallen upon it in the same instant, for he inquired, with every appearance of casual sympathy, how the injury had been sustained. "A clumsy accident with my reading lamp, Mr. Holmes," said Finch with a rueful little laugh. "I have a habit of trimming the wick too close, I fear, and I paid for my carelessness." "A common enough mishap," said Holmes, and turned the conversation a moment later to some trifling matter of the office routine, so smoothly that I doubt Finch himself perceived the burn had been remarked at all. I noted also, though I confess I thought little of it at the time, that the clerk's cuffs bore a small dark stain, such as sealing wax leaves when it has been carelessly handled while still warm. We had not long quitted the office before Lestrade himself overtook us in the street, his manner brisk with the satisfaction of a man bearing fresh intelligence. "I thought I might find you here, Mr. Holmes," said he. "We have made progress of our own, I'm glad to say. Captain Marlowe, it transpires, has debts of some magnitude, and was seen loitering near the Vale House on the very evening the drawer was forced. More than that, my men have found, in the garden behind the house, a torn envelope bearing his initials." "Indeed," said Holmes, "and was this envelope dry when it was found, or damp?" Lestrade regarded him with some surprise. "Damp, Mr. Holmes, as anything left out in such weather as we have had must be. I do not see what bearing that has upon the matter." "Perhaps none whatever," said Holmes, with a mildness that did not deceive me in the least, for I had learned that his questions were seldom so idle as he chose to make them appear. "You have not yet arrested the captain, I take it?" "Not yet, though I confess the case against him grows heavier with each hour. Debts, opportunity, and now this envelope. What more would you have, sir?" "A motive that survives close examination," said Holmes, "and a piece of evidence that was not left for you to find quite so conveniently. But I do not ask you to abandon your theory, Lestrade. I ask only that you preserve that envelope carefully and disturb nothing further in the garden until I have had occasion to look upon it myself." Lestrade, with the good-natured tolerance he generally extended to what he privately regarded as Holmes's harmless eccentricities, agreed to this readily enough, and took his leave of us at the corner of the square. As we walked on toward Baker Street through streets still hung with the last grey remnants of the fog, I ventured to remark upon the interview we had just concluded. "Finch seems an admirable young man," said I, "diligent, modest, and thoroughly devoted to his employer's interests. I confess I found nothing in him to arouse suspicion." "Nor did I say that I suspected him, Watson," Holmes replied, drawing his coat more closely about him against the damp. "I remarked only that he is a very careful young man, careful in his speech, careful in his explanations, and I think careful in a manner that a merely diligent clerk has no particular occasion to practice. A burn from a lamp wick does not commonly fall upon the ball of the thumb, my dear fellow, but rather upon the fingers that trim it. It is a small discrepancy. But I have built larger conclusions upon smaller stones than that." Chapter 5. Interviews in Kensington. Holmes announced upon the following morning that he intended to conduct a series of interviews at the Vale House, and that he would prefer for once to speak with each party alone rather than in the general assembly, which had marked our first visit. I asked him whether he had formed some settled theory that made such particularity necessary. "I have formed several theories, Watson, which is a very different matter from having formed one," said he, drawing on his gloves. "A single theory, adopted too early, has a most unfortunate tendency to select the facts that support it and discard those that do not. I prefer at this stage to accumulate facts and let them arrange themselves as they will." We found Miss Clara Vale in the small morning room at the rear of the house, and it was there, in an atmosphere less oppressive than the great drawing-room, that she at last consented to explain the silence which had told so heavily against her. "I have been ashamed, Mr. Holmes, and shame is a poor counsellor," said she, her colour rising. "During the hour in question I was not in the house at all. I had gone to a pawnbroker's in the Brompton Road to sell a brooch that was my mother's, so that I might have money of my own with which to seek legal advice, independent of Mr. Larchmont, who, however honest, is bound in some measure by his old association with my aunt's affairs. I did not wish it known that I had been reduced to such an expedient." "There is no dishonour in it," said Holmes gently, "and a good deal of practical sense. I think, Miss Vale, you will find Inspector Lestrade satisfied upon this point, once the pawnbroker has been consulted, which I shall see is done without delay." We discovered Captain Marlowe in the library, staring moodily into the cold grate, and he received Holmes's questions with a candour that did him credit, whatever construction the police had lately placed upon his conduct. "I will not deny my debts, Mr. Holmes, for they are common knowledge among my creditors if nowhere else," said he, "nor will I deny that I hope to marry Clara, and that her aunt's fortune, had it come to her as it ought, would have eased a match that poverty alone has delayed these 2 years past. But I never touched that drawer, sir, upon my honour as a soldier." "Mrs. Vale did not favour the match, I think," said Holmes. Marlowe's jaw tightened. "She thought me idle and improvident, and she was not far wrong. I feared, had I pressed my suit too openly while she lived, that she might have altered her intentions toward Clara out of pure vexation with me. It was cowardice, perhaps, that kept me silent. It was not fraud." I confess that I found in the captain's evident mortification a sincerity that sat ill with Lestrade's theory of calculated deception, and I said as much to Holmes when we had withdrawn from the library. "Embarrassment, Watson, is a most difficult thing to counterfeit convincingly," Holmes agreed, "though I have known it done, but I do not think Marlowe's shame is assumed. Deception of that particular quality generally comes more smoothly to the tongue." It was Mrs. Pritchard, however, who furnished the most curious fragment of the morning's inquiry. Questioned once more as to any visitor the household might have received in the weeks before her mistress's death, she paused, frowning in the effort of recollection, before she spoke. "Now that you press me upon it, sir, I do recall a young clerk who came from Mr. Larchmont's office, perhaps a week before my mistress was taken ill, to collect some old letters she wished copied. I cannot bring his name to mind, for I scarcely regarded him at the time, but I remember he had a quiet step about the house, quieter than most, and spectacles that gave his eyes a pale, washed-out look, as though he peered at one from behind glass." "Did Mrs. Vale herself receive him?" "She did, sir, in this very room, and he was with her above half an hour, though what passed between them I could not say, for I was not present." Holmes questioned her further as to Mrs. Vale's habits regarding her correspondence, and learned that the lady had, since her husband's death some 15 years before, invariably sealed her private letters with black wax, a custom of mourning she had never abandoned even after the strict period of grief had passed. It was in that same black wax, Mrs. Pritchard confirmed, that the family's most private papers had always been secured within the locked drawer. When the housekeeper had at last withdrawn, Holmes remained some minutes in the library, and I watched him move about the room with a silent, almost ritual deliberation that I had come to associate with his deepest concentration. He knelt again before the escritoire, measuring with his eye, and once with his own hand, the height of the desk against the drawer beneath it. He crossed to the fireplace and studied the cold ashes there, as though they held some private text legible to himself alone. He returned once more to the patch of disturbed dust beneath the desk, tracing its outline with the tip of one finger, though he touched nothing. I confess that I watched this performance, if I may call it so without disrespect, with no small bewilderment, for I could discern in it no pattern beyond the general thoroughness which marked all Holmes's investigations. When I ventured to ask him what conclusion he had drawn from his measurements, he straightened and regarded me for a moment with that faint, not unkind amusement he reserved for what he considered my more obvious questions. "I have concluded, Watson, that the person who knelt here to force this lock was neither so tall as Captain Marlowe nor so slight as Miss Vale, but was, I think, a person of quite ordinary and unremarkable height, such as would attract no particular notice in a crowd or indeed in an office," said he. "I have concluded also that this same person knew precisely where to find what he sought, and required no more than a few moments to secure it, for there is no disturbance here such as a hurried or uncertain search would leave. But I shall say no more at present, for I have found that a conclusion spoken too soon has a way of hardening into certainty before it has properly earned the right." Chapter 6. The Hidden Name. It was Holmes's custom, when a case had reached a certain stage of complexity, to withdraw for a time from the persons involved in it, and to seek instead the silent testimony of the records and documents, which he held to be, upon the whole, more reliable witnesses than any living tongue. It was in this spirit that we made our way, upon the morning following our interviews in Kensington, to Somerset House, where the great archives of birth, marriage, and death lie ranged in their solemn volumes for whoever has patience enough to consult them. Holmes worked for the better part of 2 hours among the registers, tracing the Vale family through 3 generations with a swiftness that left me toiling some distance behind him in my own more modest efforts at assistance. It was he who at last closed the final volume with a small decisive motion and turned to me with the light of discovery in his eye. There was indeed a Redmond connection, Watson, though it lies farther back and reaches a good deal further from the truth than our Mr. Silas Redmond would have us believe, said he. A cousin of Mrs. Vale's mother, one Josiah Redmond, did in fact exist, and might, had he lived, have furnished a most respectable pedigree for our client's rival. But Josiah Redmond died in the year 61 in Bristol, without issue, and his branch of the family, so far as these registers can tell us, ends with him as surely as a line drawn upon a page. Then the whole claim rests upon a dead man, I said. Upon a dead man's name, which is a very different and far more dangerous thing, Holmes replied. A living relation may be questioned, examined, exposed by the simple friction of ordinary intercourse. A dead one, known only through a name and a date, may be dressed in whatever character his resurrectionist chooses to give him. I begin to suspect, Watson, that our forger has not merely copied a signature or aged a sheet of paper. He has constructed an entire identity, piecing together fragments of genuine family history with such art that the seams scarcely show. We proceeded thereafter to a small stationer's shop in the Strand, one that Holmes had long employed for such inquiries as required an expert eye upon paper and ink, and there an elderly gentleman of the establishment, a Mr. Pemberton, examined for us a specimen of the disputed document, which Larchmont had by then furnished to Holmes under seal of strictest confidence. "This paper is not old, Mr. Holmes, whatever appearance it may present to a casual eye," said Pemberton, holding the sheet up to the window and turning it this way and that beneath his glass. "It has been treated, I should say, with moisture and with smoke, in a manner calculated to imitate the effects of long storage. You will observe here, along the edge, a faint uniformity of discoloration that true age never produces, for age works upon a sheet unevenly, according to how it has lain and what has touched it. This is the work of a careful hand, but a hand working swiftly, within days rather than years." "And the ink?" Holmes inquired. "Dark at first glance, as you say, but hold it thus against the light." The old stationer tilted the paper, and I saw for myself, or believed I saw, a faint bluish undertone lurking beneath the black, such as I should never have detected unassisted. "That is a modern ink, sir, whatever pains have been taken to darken its appearance. I could not swear to its maker, but I could swear it was not made when this document pretends to have been written." We left the shop with Holmes unusually silent, his stick tapping the pavement in a slow, meditative rhythm as we walked. The forgery, Watson, grows more elaborate the more we examine it, and elaboration of this kind is seldom the work of a single mind acting alone upon a single impulse, said he at length. Consider who stood to gain by such a scheme, and consider also who possessed the particular knowledge and access that its construction must have required. I turned the matter over as we walked, and found myself reciting the possibilities aloud, as much to order my own thoughts as to inform his. Miss Vale might gain, I suppose, were she somehow to discredit Redmond, and thereby secure the estate entirely to herself, free of any rival claim. Captain Marlowe might gain through his marriage to her, should that inheritance come to pass. Redmond himself appears to gain everything, upon the face of it. Larchmont has nothing to gain and a great deal to lose, should it emerge that his own office passed such papers as genuine. And Finch, said Holmes quietly. Finch is a clerk, Holmes, drawing a clerk's modest salary. What could he hope to gain from another man's inheritance? Access, my dear Watson, to every form, every seal, every scrap of family correspondence that passed through that office, said Holmes. And access in the hands of a patient and resentful man is very often worth more than any single legacy. I do not say that Finch is our forger. I say only that of all the persons in this affair, he alone possessed the means to construct so elaborate a deception whatever his motive for doing so might prove to be. We walked some distance in silence after this, the fog beginning once more to thicken about the lamp-posts as the afternoon waned toward evening. It was Holmes who spoke again, in that low, reflective tone he employed when some conclusion had settled in his mind before he was yet prepared to declare it openly. "There is a type of criminal, Watson, more dangerous by far than the bold housebreaker or the desperate footpad, for he commits his theft in broad daylight, with the law's own machinery as his accomplice, and is thanked more often than not by his very victims for the diligence with which he is assisted in his own crime. Such a man does not raise his hand against you. He raises only his pen, and smiles, and is thought a model of quiet usefulness by all who know him." "You speak as though you had already fixed upon your man," said I. "I speak as though I had fixed upon a type, which is not at all the same thing," Holmes replied, and would say no more upon the subject that evening, though I observed that he did not sleep until a late hour, and that a thin line of lamplight showed beneath his door long after Mrs. Hudson's household had retired. Chapter 7. The Arrest of Captain Marlowe. The blow, when it fell swiftly, and I confess it took me as much by surprise as it did the household in Kensington. We had scarcely breakfasted upon the following morning when a messenger arrived from Lestrade, requesting Holmes's presence at once, and we found, upon reaching Captain Marlowe's lodgings in Mount Street, a scene of considerable disorder, with 2 constables standing guard at the door and the inspector himself in a state of ill-concealed triumph. "We have him now, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade as we mounted the narrow stair, "and I will own that I take no pleasure in it, for the captain seemed to me upon the whole an honest sort of scoundrel. But honesty in manner and honesty in fact are 2 different articles, as this morning's work has proved." He led us into a small sitting-room, plainly furnished in the manner of a gentleman living somewhat beyond the limits of a modest income, and pointed to a loose brick in the fireplace surround, now pried away to reveal a shallow cavity behind it. "There, Mr. Holmes, concealed with some care, though not, I am glad to say, with care enough. Within the cavity, laid upon a square of oiled cloth, we found the missing family certificates, together with several of the private letters taken from the library drawer, and beside them a single half-burned sheet of paper bearing, in a faltering and evidently practising hand, some dozen attempts at the signature of Honoria Vale. Marlowe himself sat in a chair by the window, his face grey and his hands clasped before him with the stillness of a man too stunned for protest. Clara Vale, who had been sent for, stood near him, her composure of the previous days entirely broken, and I saw in her eyes an anguish that spoke more eloquently than any words of what this discovery had cost her. "I did not put those papers there," said Marlowe, in a voice from which all its former colour had drained. "I swear it upon whatever honour a soldier may still claim who stands accused as I do. I have never seen that half-burned sheet before this hour." "The evidence, Captain, speaks a good deal louder than protestation," said Lestrade, not unkindly, but with the settled firmness of a man whose case has closed about him like a door. "You had debts. You had access to the house. You had by your own admission a strong motive to see Mr. Redmond's claim discredited, that you might marry Miss Vale into a fortune restored. I am afraid I have no choice, sir, but to place you under arrest." I watched this grim ceremony performed with a heavy heart, for whatever suspicion I had entertained of Marlowe in the earlier days of the affair, our interview in the library had left me disposed to think well of him, and I found myself, despite every circumstance now arrayed against him, unwilling to believe him guilty of so calculated a fraud. Yet the evidence, laid bare before us, seemed to admit of no other conclusion, and I confess that even my own faith wavered as the constables led him away. Holmes alone, throughout this melancholy scene, preserved an expression of detached and curious interest, as though he watched not a man's ruin, but some experiment proceeding to its natural term. He asked Lestrade's permission to examine the half-burned sheet, before it was removed as evidence, and this being granted, he bent over it for some minutes with his lens, in a silence that I, mindful of Clara's distress, found myself resenting on her behalf. "You will observe, Watson," said he at last, straightening and beckoning me to his side, "that these are not the practice strokes of a man learning to imitate Mrs. Vale's own hand. Compare them, if you will, with a genuine specimen of her writing, which I obtained from Miss Vale upon an earlier visit." He drew from his pocket-book a folded letter and laid it beside the charred fragment. Here, in the true hand, the downstroke of the capital H begins boldly and thins toward its foot, as a hand accustomed to the pen will naturally produce. But observe this practice attempt. The hesitation falls not where a man copying Mrs. Vale's own writing would hesitate, but at a point some little distance further on, precisely where a copyist would falter, who was not imitating her hand at all, but imitating another man's imitation of it. I do not follow you, Holmes. These are forgeries of a forgery, Watson. Whoever practised upon this sheet was not attempting to reproduce Mrs. Vale's genuine signature, which he had perhaps never closely studied, but was labouring instead to reproduce the false signature already affixed to the letters of administration, a signature he had seen, presumably, only at second hand, or from memory, or from some specimen less perfect than the original forgery itself. He folded the letter away again, his face grave. "It is a subtle distinction, but a sure one, and it tells us a curious thing, Lestrade. Whoever concealed these papers here did not create the original forgery at all. He merely copied it, badly, and left the copy behind him as false witness against an innocent man." Lestrade received this observation with the patient scepticism of a man who has heard Holmes's theories confounded by fact before now, and who is not disposed to abandon a solid arrest upon so delicate a point of penmanship. "It is an ingenious notion, Mr. Holmes, but I must deal in evidence as it lies before me, and it lies very heavily against the captain." We took our leave shortly afterward, and Clara Vale, white and trembling, pressed Holmes's hand at the door with a mute appeal that I do not think he was inclined to disappoint. As we walked away through the grey morning streets, Holmes was silent for some little while, his brows drawn down in that concentration I had learned to prize above almost any other sign of progress in his work. "The police, Watson," said he at last, "have found the theatre prop tonight, but they have not yet found the actor who left it upon the stage. It remains for us to discover the hand that set this whole performance in motion, and I think, my dear fellow, that hand is a good deal nearer to us than Captain Marlowe's cell." Chapter 8. The One Detail. The newspapers, by the following morning, had made a considerable feast of Captain Marlowe's arrest, and I could not open the Chronicle at breakfast without encountering some fresh account of the affair, each more confident than the last in its assurance that the mystery of the Vale inheritance had been satisfactorily resolved. Lestrade, I gathered from a brief note that reached us before noon, was well pleased with the credit the case had brought him, and saw no reason to look further than the loose brick in Mount Street for the whole of his explanation. Larchmont, too, called upon us that afternoon, and though he could not conceal a certain relief that the fraud had proved, upon the official view, to lie entirely outside his own office, he seemed to me a man whose conscience was not wholly at ease. "I am glad, of course, that no blame attaches to my firm," said he, seating himself with the careful deliberation of a man not yet certain he has earned the right to relax. "And yet, Mr. Holmes, I confess the matter sits ill with me still. Finch has been of the greatest assistance these past days, offering to help reconstruct what remains of the estate's damaged records, and I own I do not know how I should have managed without him. But I cannot rid myself of some small unreasoning disquiet, though I could not tell you its cause if my life depended upon it. Unreasoning disquiet, Mr. Larchmont, is very often reason that has not yet found its evidence," said Holmes. "I should not dismiss it too readily. I confess that I myself had very nearly settled into the general contentment that had overtaken the case, for the evidence against Marlowe, however Holmes might quarrel with a hesitation mark here or a stroke of the pen there, had seemed to me, in its sum, a formidable thing, and I said as much when Larchmont had taken his leave. "You are very nearly persuaded, Watson, and I do not wonder at it, for the police case is built with a certain crude effectiveness," said Holmes, drawing from his pocket the small fragment of black wax he had taken from the library carpet some days before, and turning it slowly between his fingers in the lamplight. But I have never yet abandoned a single detail, merely because the general current of opinion had swept past it, and I do not propose to begin with this one. He held the fragment up so that I might examine it through his lens, and directed my attention to a faint mark pressed into one broken face of the wax, so slight that I had taken it, upon our first examination, for nothing more than an accidental crease. You will observe, Watson, that this is not the impression of a signet ring, such as a private gentleman or lady might wear, but the faint remaining curve of a formal seal, the kind employed by a legal office in the sealing of its more solemn documents. Mrs. Vale, we know from Mrs. Pritchard, used black wax for her private correspondence, but she used it, as any lady of her generation would, with no seal beyond her own initial, pressed by a small hand stamp kept upon her writing table. This wax bears the ghost of something a good deal more elaborate, and a good deal more official. Then it didn't come from her own correspondence at all. It did not. It came, I think, from a packet sealed elsewhere at some legal office, and carried afterward into that library, where it was opened, its contents disposed as the forger required, and its wax allowed to fall, forgotten, upon the carpet. The burglary of that drawer, Watson, was staged after the true theft had already been accomplished, not before it, and staged moreover by a hand that had grown careless in its confidence. He turned then to a second matter, drawing from his desk a small memorandum in his own hand, upon which he had recorded some days before his observations regarding the torn envelope discovered in the Vale garden. You will recall that Lestrade found this envelope damp and bearing Captain Marlowe's initials, and took it as proof that the captain had visited the garden on the night the fog lay thick upon Kensington. But I have since had occasion to examine the fibres of the paper beneath a stronger glass than the one I carried into the garden itself, and I find the tear was made while the paper was entirely dry, its edges sharp and unsoftened, and that the dampness came upon it afterward, seeping in gradually from the general moisture of the night air. The envelope was not dropped during a hurried visit in the fog. It was planted before the fog descended at all, and left to be discovered when the weather itself should lend it a false appearance of that night's misadventure. I sat for some minutes turning these two revelations over in my mind, and found in them, at last, the shape of a design far more calculated than any panic-driven burglary could account for. Then someone has laboured, Holmes, not merely to steal this inheritance, but to build, brick upon careful brick, a case against two innocent people in turn, first Miss Vale, and now the captain. Precisely so, Watson, and a man who builds with such patience does not build carelessly at the last. I think it time we set a small trap of our own, rather than continue merely to dismantle his. He drew a sheet of paper toward him and began to write, in a quick, decisive hand, a brief note addressed to Mr. Larchmont, requesting that he ask Finch to bring to Baker Street, upon the following morning, all duplicate copies of the estate papers that remained in the office, that Holmes might examine them at his leisure before the matter was finally closed. "You believe he will come?" said I. "I believe, Watson, that a man who has taken such pains to appear helpful throughout this affair will find it a good deal harder to refuse one final act of helpfulness than to perform it," Holmes replied, sealing the note with a small private satisfaction that I had learned, over the years, to regard as the surest sign that the end of a case was very near at hand. Chapter 9. Holmes reveals the forgery. The gathering that assembled in our sitting room upon the following morning was as singular a company as I had ever seen brought together beneath that modest roof. Mr. Larchmont arrived first, punctual and grave, followed shortly by Miss Clara Vale, whose composure had returned to her, though it was plainly a composure maintained by will rather than ease. Inspector Lestrade came next, wearing the guarded expression of a man who suspects he is about to be made to look foolish, and has resolved to bear it with what dignity he can muster. Captain Marlowe, released upon Holmes's earlier representations pending further inquiry, arrived pale and subdued, and took a chair a little apart from the others. Mrs. Pritchard was shown up soon after, plainly ill at ease in surroundings so far removed from her own domestic province. Mr. Silas Redmond came last of all, his manner as diffident and apologetic as ever, though I fancied I detected beneath it a certain watchfulness that had not been so evident at our first meeting. Mr. Tobias Finch arrived punctually at the hour appointed, a leather satchel of duplicate papers under his arm, his countenance composed in that same mild, attentive expression I had remarked at our earlier interview. He greeted the company with quiet civility and took the chair Holmes indicated near the window without the least appearance of unease. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind him, and surveyed us all for a long moment before he began to speak. "I have asked you here," said he, "to bring to its proper conclusion a case which the police, in their natural haste, believed already closed. Captain Marlowe, I am glad to say, stands in no further danger from the law, for the evidence found in his lodgings was placed there by another hand than his own." Lestrade stirred in his chair, but said nothing, and Holmes continued. "The practice signatures found upon that half-burned sheet were not, as I demonstrated to the inspector some days ago, attempts to imitate Mrs. Vale's own hand, but attempts to imitate a forgery already made, an imitation of an imitation, hesitating at points where only a copyist working from the false document, rather than from Mrs. Vale's true correspondence, would naturally falter. Captain Marlowe's guilt, gentlemen, was a stage property, manufactured and planted to satisfy the police with a motive of debt and disappointed romance. Motives real enough in themselves, but entirely unconnected with the crime for which they were made to answer. He turned next toward Redmond, who had grown very still in his chair. "You, sir, are not the architect of this fraud, whatever part you have consented to play in it. You were chosen, I think, because your appearance answered well enough to a vague description preserved in old family letters, and because you could sustain, under modest and infrequent questioning, the character of a provincial cousin unused to society. I do not think you devised the scheme that has brought you here. I think you were furnished with it, complete, and paid to wear it as another man might wear a borrowed coat." Redmond's composure broke at last, and he sank back in his chair with the air of a man from whom some long-sustained effort has suddenly been withdrawn. "I never meant real harm to the young lady," he murmured. "I was told the estate had no true heir, that I should be righting a wrong rather than committing one. I see now how I was used." "We shall come to the truth of that presently," said Holmes. "The architect of this fraud, the true author of the forged letters of administration, the false genealogy, and the staged burglary of the library drawer, sits among us now, and has sat among us throughout, offering at every turn his quiet and indispensable assistance." Every eye in the room turned, following the direction of Holmes's gaze to where Tobias Finch sat by the window, his satchel of papers still upon his knee. "Mr. Finch," said Holmes, "had access to every file in Mr. Larchmont's office, and knew, before any other person outside the household, that Mrs. Vale had died without a will. He discovered, in old family correspondence entrusted to his employer's care, the record of an extinct Redmond branch, dead these 25 years, and saw in that dead man's name a vessel he might fill as he pleased. He prepared the forged letters of administration himself, employing genuine legal forms, a copied seal, and paper artificially aged with moisture and smoke, a process which left upon his own cuffs the faint dark stains I observed at our first meeting in his office. He furnished Mr. Redmond with sufficient family detail to withstand casual inquiry. He visited Mrs. Vale's house some days before the fraud was set in motion, ostensibly to collect old letters for copying, and used that visit to remove such papers and certificates as might have exposed the falseness of his invented genealogy. Finch's face had grown very white, though he had not yet spoken, and Holmes proceeded without pause. He returned later to force the library drawer himself, that the theft of those papers might appear a burglary committed after the fact rather than before it, and in his haste he let fall a sliver of black sealing wax bearing the faint impression of a legal office seal, a mark that could never have come from Mrs. Vale's own modest correspondence stamp. When suspicion required a fresh direction, he planted the stolen certificates, together with his own practice forgeries, in Captain Marlowe's lodgings, relying upon the captain's debts and disappointed hopes to complete the picture. His final proof against himself he carries upon his own hand, gentlemen, for the burn upon his thumb came not from a lamp wick, as he told us, but from the heated wax and pressed seal by which he counterfeited an official stamp, and the ink upon his cuffs matches precisely the modern ink employed throughout the forged documents. For a long moment Finch said nothing, his hands very still upon the satchel in his lap. Then, all at once, the careful composure that had sustained him through every interview fell away, and he covered his face and spoke, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, words that were, at last, a confession. Chapter 10. Watson's Reflection. Finch's confession, when it came haltingly, and I confess that I listened to it with a strange admixture of professional interest and simple human pity. For whatever crime the man had committed, there was something in his broken composure that spoke less of triumph undone than of some long private grievance at last laid bare. He had been born, he told us, under another name entirely, the natural son of a connection distantly related to the Vale household, through a scandal buried 2 generations deep, a circumstance he had discovered only some years before, when a chance paper had fallen into his hands during the ordinary course of his clerical duties. He had grown, from that discovery, into a conviction that he had been cheated of a respectability that was rightly his, and had nursed the grievance in silence, as such men often do, until Mrs. Vale's death without a will had presented him, as he saw it, with an opportunity too perfect to resist. The fraud had been, in his own halting words, both a theft and a reckoning, a means of taking what he believed the world had wrongly withheld from him, and of doing so, moreover, beneath the very noses of those who had never troubled to suspect a quiet clerk of anything beyond diligence. Lestrade, to his credit, heard the confession through without interruption, and it was only when Finch had fallen silent, his face buried once more in his hands, that the inspector rose and performed, with a gravity that became him, the melancholy duty of his office. The days that followed brought a general and welcome restoration of order to the affairs of the Vale estate. Mr. Redmond, whose part in the conspiracy had been that of a hired instrument rather than a willing architect, cooperated fully with the authorities in exchange for such leniency as his candour might earn him, and I understand that his sentence, when it came, was tempered accordingly. Finch himself was committed for trial upon charges of forgery and theft, and I have no doubt that the law dealt with him according to its proper severity, though I confess I could never afterward think of him without some faint shadow of the pity his own confession had first aroused in me. Captain Marlowe emerged from his brief and unjust ordeal a chastened man, for the public exposure of his debts, however innocent he had proved of the graver charge, had cost him something of the easy assurance that had marked him at our first meeting. Yet I understood, from a note Clara Vale was good enough to send us some weeks later, that his character had risen rather than fallen in her estimation for the quiet dignity with which he had borne his arrest, and that Mrs. Vale's old objections to the match, whatever their former weight, were not likely to trouble the young couple's happiness for very much longer. Clara Vale herself regained in due course her rightful place as administrator of her aunt's estate, and chose, with a wisdom that did her credit, to retain Mr. Larchmont's guidance in its management, notwithstanding the unhappy circumstance by which his office had so nearly been made the unwitting instrument of fraud. Larchmont, for his part, was spared the professional ruin he had so plainly feared, once Holmes had made it clear, both to the Law Society and to the wider public, that he had acted throughout in perfect good faith, deceived by a servant whose duplicity had been calculated with a patience few employers could reasonably have anticipated. I paid one further visit to the Kensington house before the affair passed finally into memory, and found Mrs. Pritchard restoring the household keys to Miss Vale's keeping in a small, quiet ceremony that moved me more than I should have expected, for there was in it something of the natural order righting itself after a long and unnatural disturbance, the true mistress of the house receiving back, at last, what had never rightly ceased to be her own. It was some evenings later, as Holmes and I sat once more before our own fire in Baker Street, the fog having lifted at last to reveal a clear and frosty night beyond our windows, that I ventured to ask him how he had first come to suspect Finch above the others, when the clerk's manner had seemed to every eye but his own the very picture of honest diligence. "The police, Watson, saw motive where it shouted loudest," said he, filling his pipe with the slow deliberation he generally reserved for such reflective moments. "Debt, romance, disappointed inheritance, these are motives that announce themselves, and the police, who must deal in probabilities rather than certainties, are naturally drawn to whatever motive speaks most plainly. I have found, in my own small experience, that truth prefers to whisper, a sliver of wax bearing the wrong impression, a pen held awkwardly by a hand unused to holding it as its own, an envelope torn dry and wetted only afterward by a fog that had not yet descended when the tearing was done. These are not the details a guilty man thinks to guard, Watson, precisely because he does not think of them as evidence at all. And Finch's very helpfulness, I said, was itself the surest mark against him. Just so. The most useful criminal is very often the one whom everyone thanks for his assistance, for he has arranged matters so that his usefulness is offered before it can be requested, and gratitude once given is a poor soil for suspicion to take root in. Holmes drew upon his pipe and regarded the fire for a long moment in silence. Legal crimes, my dear fellow, are seldom built upon bold lies. They are built upon respectable appearances, upon our own trained willingness to trust paper and seal and quiet collar, and it is precisely that trust which the cleverest rogues learn to make their most reliable accomplice. I have set down this narrative, as I've set down others before it, in the conviction that it illustrates, better than any words of mine could independently express, the singular power of reason when joined to patient and disciplined observation. For if there is one lesson I have carried away from that grey November of fog and forgery, it is this, that truth, however deeply it may be buried beneath the careful contrivances of clever men, leaves always some small and stubborn trace behind it, waiting only for an eye patient enough and clear enough to pierce even the thickest London fog.